I wanted to share a bit of a story from our office. Our office moved from Santa Monica to downtown Los Angeles about 2 years ago, and it prompted a question for us. Really, what was the future of work? What did the workplace look like? But I want to ask everybody here to think momentarily about what the building that contains this kind of space looks like. Because I would say it's ubiquitous. It's all over the United States. There's nearly 10 billion square feet of office space in the United States, which is an astonishing number. And unfortunately, a lot of it contains stuff like this. When we moved 2 years ago, this was what the space looked like that we took over. It was a former banking hall. It housed Bank of America for a number of years in downtown Los Angeles. And when we moved in, we saw a transformation happening, not only in the banking industry, which no longer had rows of tellers, a field of desks with banking executives, but everything was going digital. It was an era that change was happening not only in their workplace, but in ours as well. So when we took over this building, which is a freestanding building in downtown Los Angeles, and next to a number of tall buildings adjacent to it, we wanted to do something different. We cut holes in the ceiling, in the roof, we cut holes in the uppermost floor, we hung floors, we made skylights, and we transformed the space into something that for us was about socializing at work, was about collaborating at work, was about learning at work, and it was about having a certain amount of focus time at work, which is somewhere somebody wants you to focus, right? But it allowed us to do things different. It allowed us to host events. In fact, we've hosted people from TEDx before at our office, and to have daily events where we could engage with the public in a totally different way than what that first image was that you saw. It allowed our culture to come through, sort of bike culture that we have, as much as the communal activities as well. And it truly was a transformation not only for us, but in the way that we projected our brand and our culture to the city. And it was this project that ultimately birthed this concept that we called hackable buildings. It was the idea of transforming buildings beyond what their original use was into something that was completely and totally different than what it was at firstly intended for. And we were interested, how would you recreate this? How would you move this forward? Because it certainly wasn't an idea that you necessarily would replicate in its original context, but the genesis of that, what we thought was really important. So to think about moving forward, we had to look backwards a bit. We started with 12 buildings in downtown, just looking at what the opportunity was. What we saw were buildings that were built before World War II. These were small buildings. A lot of the buildings are like what you see on the west side of Los Angeles, letter form buildings, built for natural ventilation, buildings that were small footprint buildings. Then we went into the post-World War to 1970s, and these buildings took on mechanical ventilation. They took on mechanical vertical transportation, so elevators started to show up. And then in the 1990s, everything went crazy. This is because of the tax break that occurred in the 50s and the 60s that really motivated companies no longer to own their buildings, but instead occupy buildings that were provided by speculators or developers. So between these three different eras, there's a wide spectrum of buildings, but the common level is that the floor plates or the general area that people occupy is actually pretty similar. The difference is the total size, and those early buildings are really easy to change. They're easy to change because of not only the elevatoring that's inside of them, but they're easy to change in terms of their use. So the early buildings changed to lofts, they changed to apartments, they changed to hotels. They're small, easy to convert from one use all the way to the other. The changes coming up is in these later buildings. They're the 1990 buildings. They're the tall buildings. And our question for us is, what's going to happen to these buildings? Because the time of conversion for these buildings is shrinking shorter and shorter and shorter. So we were asked, what's the office building of the future? And our response back was a new building even necessary? And think of an architect or a designer answering that question was, are we going to build new buildings? Was the office building of North America a new building? Because in North America, we have an incredible supply of buildings. Unlike Asia, which has no supply and is truly looking for demand to meet their demand, we knew that there was something fundamentally changing in the future of work. We saw three drivers. First, mobility, second, sustainability, and the third one was speed to market, or how fast could we ultimately deliver on some of these ideas. Because everything that was once static is now mobile. We've put every piece of technology into people's hands, and we sent them out into the workplace. That's no longer sending them out to work, it's actually sending them out into the field. The largest disturbance for us is mobility as architects. It means that everything that was once permanent, in terms of office hierarchy, the kind of lease steps or the space between elevators and the outside of the buildings, all those things are fundamentally changing for us. companies are shrinking the footprints, the amount of space that they're taking. It doesn't mean that companies are getting smaller, but what it does mean is that they're using less space. They're allowing their employees to work outside and to work at Starbucks and to work in a retailer. And so incrementally, they're taking less and less space. And we started asking ourselves, so what's happening to all this space? If this is a trend that continues to move on, people take less and less space, all these office buildings, what's going to happen? Historically, it would be companies, much like the ones that we're vacating, would be moving in. And those companies are startups, much of like what we're in here today and along the west side, are taking on totally different kind of buildings. So we asked ourselves, what's going to happen with those buildings? What's going to happen as people begin to vacate the taller buildings? What happens to the single-purpose office building? Because from a point of view of sustainability, isn't reuse the most incredibly sustainable thing you could do? Does a paradigm for a new office building really require a brand new building? So reuse was a fundamental driver for this. The other thing was speed to market. And what we decided was the ability to be able to make small interventions incrementally was much more financially savvy than to do a brand new building, which you see there on the right. Instead, you would take these existing buildings and you'd make interventions incrementally over time, generating a certain amount of revenue. And those interventions could be small, they could be change from both retail uses and change of uses to much more substantial ones. So you do things like penetrate floors in buildings, make connectivity really meaningful, like what you saw in our office at the very beginning. Maybe remove a floor and have volume like what you have here, not that 10-foot floor-to-floor space like you saw in that first image. Or make skylights. Maybe skylights that even open and get a breeze through here every once in a while. Have elevators to allow vertical circulation inside, begin to add sustainable features and really make the building a much more symbiotic relationship with its environment, and do things like bring natural light in and don't rely on artificial lighting quite as much. Add services and functionality, all types of different things. Get as aggressive as we possibly could, even move a floor. So the idea that we put out there was that hacking was no longer a technology, it was really about a culture. It was about an empowerment cycle. It was about getting people to really demand more out of buildings than they ever had before. And so we applied that concept to 2 different projects, one in DC and one in Los Angeles. The first one is the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, DC, and for any of those who don't know that building, that's the FBI building. So by the fact that I'm saying that we want to hack the FBI, I'm sure I'm going to show up on a watch list. In fact, I'm probably already being watched right now. It's right along Pennsylvania Avenue, for those of you who are not familiar with it, and it's an enormous building. It's nearly 2 million square feet. And what we offered up the idea of is putting things like public uses like a soccer field and a public park on top of the building, giving a privileged view of Washington, D.C. that is not really afforded to the public, exposing vertical transportation and stairs on the outside, making a connection to Pennsylvania Avenue and opening up a courtyard, which most people are completely and totally unaware that exists, and changing the uses in the building. Where you see here now is a hotel on the right-hand side, office building to the left, being able to make a connection to that courtyard, retail up above, and an outdoor area on the very top. This transforms the landscape of what buildings look like in cities, because no longer are you dropping buildings down to the ground and building a brand new building, but instead you're hot rodding them. You're augmenting the buildings that already exist. The next building was a building in Los Angeles. It's the Union Bank Tower. It was the first high-rise done in the Bunker Hill development, and really a classic example of the kind of ubiquitous uniform office buildings that we saw as sort of modern buildings. Our idea here was to sectionally change this building up through the building overall height. It meant putting in high assembly spaces like this on the ground floor so that when people gathered and in the event of an emergency could get out. So we talked about spaces that could be used for education, for socializing, much like this with an amphitheater, an auditorium. And as you'd move up vertically through the building, you'd have uses like education, underneath a fitness center, underneath a hotel, because we understand that the contemporary worker is also a very nomadic person, moving from site to site, continually in motion. Filling in floor plates that are not being used with things like data centers, because the positive out of data centers is they generate an enormous amount of waste heat, and you can use waste heat to generate things like hot water for retail and for residential and for spas. and fill in a certain portion of this with traditional office, but maybe on the upper floors, begin to allow brands to expose themselves, to carve out volume inside of the building like we've never really seen before. And the idea and the hope here is that when you begin to see this happen, not only in one building, but maybe multiples, is they begin to emerge on the outside of the buildings, that these buildings begin to change over time. And it's not only in one building, but it's in a whole city landscape. So I just want you to think about, this is what we have today, and what we'd really like to see is buildings that have much more of a diverse population and identity about them. And maybe if we push it a little bit farther, we can do this across the whole city. Thank you.